He might actually be the most derivative one of all. I mean, Christ, the same house.
Maybe so, but you forgot the first rule of surviving a stab movie. Never answer the...
I'm bored.
Wait!
And welcome back to Horror Queers. In case you don't know who we are, I'm Joe.
And I'm Trace.
And we are delighted to have been invited by Horror in Color to contribute to Pride or Die.
Woo! Pride or Die, y'all.
Yeah, so we thought what we would do to celebrate a little bit of Pride is talk about our favorite queer horror films from various subgenres. So Trace, why don't you start us off?
Yeah. So we picked some really fun subgenres, I think. But of course, we had to start with one of our favorites, Joe, which is the slasher subgenre. So when thinking of queer horror, I feel like in recent years, there's one particular slasher that's come out that, you know, it's a foreign film, so maybe what it has doesn't have like national recognition, but I think it's a very, very important entry into the queer horror canon.
Right.
And that would be Jan Gonzalez's Knife Plus Heart, a giallo of sorts that it takes place in the world of 70s French gay pornography as a masked black-gloved killer is killing all of our gay porn stars.
Yes, in delightfully queer, semi-homophobic fashion.
Yeah.
So there's like there's some catharsis, there's some nudity. It's very like sexually progressive as well in the way that I feel like only the French are really doing right now. So that's enjoyable.
I mean, honestly, anything's more so than Americans. Like, I just say general European, but yes,
Right.
The film is very sex positive in a very, very good way.
Indeed. Yeah, it is a favorite. And I think it's a good one to start us off because we did try to select some out of the box picks, you know, so we're not going to do like Freddy's Revenge or something like that.
when I was like, oh, slasher, like, I don't want to do Freddy's Revenge. Like, what's something that's not Freddy's Revenge? Because I feel like, and it sucks to even say this, right? But I feel like it's like, oh, that's kind of like just a cliche pick at this point. It's like, that's always the one people go to.
Yeah, it's just a little more obvious. So we wanted to do a couple of out of the boxes, and we're also going to do a couple obvious ones. But Knife Plus Heart is such a fantastic pick, and if people haven't watched it, they should.
Enormous agree on that. Yeah, seek it out.
Yeah, so my pick for this subcategory is Hello, Mary Lou, Prom Night 2. Folks may look at this film as like, oh, isn't that kind of like a trashy sequel to the Jamie Lee Curtis film? Like, isn't it one of 5 different sequels? It's not, but it is a great low budget Canadian sequel. It's got a fantastic heroine to the extent that you will wish she was actually on screen more than she actually is. But watching this film sort of like go into action, it just goes into such bizarre places.
It really does. And, you know, we talk about, anyone who listens to our show will know that we talk about boring protagonist syndrome a lot. And this character really avoids that. However, part of it is because she's possessed by a very, very, very fun bitch ghost. Right. Although I will say, I'm a little surprised you put this in the slasher category because it's a little slasher light. It's more in the, well, funnily enough, in the next category we're going to discuss. But
this is true.
If y'all have never seen Hello, Mary Lou, Prom Night 2, I'm a person who thinks the first Prom Night's kind of
boring.
Like, it's fine. It's not one I really revisit a lot. Prom Night 2 is like camp incarnate. This is a fantastically fun film, devilishly entertaining. It has a real, just like a fun, witty streak to it. It's a lot smarter than you would think it would be.
Exactly. Yes, it's just a really, really good time. So if you've ever written it off because you either thought the box art looks silly or, oh, it's a direct-to-video sequel, you know what? Give it a try. It's actually very worth your time.
Yeah, I'm still waiting on a Blu-ray for this film, by the way.
Jesus Christ, come
on. Well, I teased it. So yeah, our next subgenre of horror is going to be the possession or paranoia subgenre, although I think both of us went the possession route-ish.
True.
So I went with, well, I guess what I would call a more cliche pick now, because this film has definitely kind of risen in public esteem over the past couple of years. But this is, of course, Karan Kusama's much initially maligned film, Jennifer's Body. And now it's a film that everyone has agreed is a brilliant and genius film.
Indeed, yes. We've all had our renaissance on this. We've come around to it and recognized that, you know what? We did this film dirty back in the day.
100%. Although I don't know about you, Joe, but I was there in theaters opening weekend because
I paid my money.
I wanted to see Amanda Seyfried say fuck.
Yeah, and I was excited because I feel like back then I didn't really know what Megan Fox was capable of. I was looking forward to seeing her vamp it up on screen.
And vamp it up she does. Honestly, like, I think that's my favorite thing about the renaissance of this film is that Megan Fox's performance has become
Iconic.
much more very iconic, right? And I think, for the longest time, people were like, oh, like Megan Fox can act. She's just like a body that to put on screen. And this film really shows that she does have the range, even if she is kind of playing, I would argue, a caricature of the public perception of Megan Fox in the film.
Exactly. She's leaning into what you think of her, but she's doing it in a very smart, very sexy, and again, like I would argue, sex positive way, which is something
Very
that we
much so.
find a lot in these queer horror films.
And this is an explicitly queer film, that at the time was misread for being like, oh, it's just going to titillate like male teenage boys. And it's like, no, like this is a film made by women for women, actually, for teenage girls.
Yeah, exactly. So my pick is not a female possession film because that is one of the things that I get a little tired of when we talk
Mm-hmm.
about possession narratives. It's often a
Sure.
teenage girl in a white nightgown with an exorcist, maybe. But so I went the opposite route and I decided to go with a male possession. So I picked Adam Egypt Mortimer's Daniel Isn't Real, which finds a boy being possessed by another boy. It's got some great body horror. It's got some really like nightmarish hallucinatory imagery, and it's got a great pair of leading performances with some really good homoerotic tension between the two.
100%. It's funny. This could also be called nepotism, the movie, because it is Susan Sarandon and Tim Robbins' son, Miles
Mm-hmm.
Robbins, being possessed by Arnold Schwarzenegger's son, Patrick Schwarzenegger.
Yes.
Both of whom, though, are very good,
really good
in this movie.
Yes. Yeah. This is to me a bit of an underrated, unheralded recent gem where people, I feel like it's just not on a lot of people's radars. So, whatever we can do to kind of amplify that, I feel like it's a good one to do with.
Yeah, and again, this is one that you have to do more of a queer read on it. Like it is homoerotic, I agree, but it's not exactly explicitly queer. Where it's like but any kind of male possession film like kind of falls into that homoerotic area.
For sure, yes.
Okay, well, our next subgenre of horror is going to be gothic or period, and it was interesting. There's plenty of
So
older,
many.
40s, 50s, 60s. Like, I could have gone with like, any of the lesbian vampire films from like the Hammer horror series, but
Yeah.
I actually need to go with something more modern. This is actually 2021's Fear Street Part 3, 1666. I honestly picked this because I wanted to highlight the entire Fear Street trilogy in general, because this was a major like 3-month event done in 2021 by Netflix. And this is explicitly queer
So
horror.
queer.
We have
So
our queer
queer.
protagonists. It's all over the place. The plot of each film does revolve around queerness, but mostly this 1666 one, which kind of brings to a close the events of 1994, but also all the witch trial stuff in 1666 involves lesbianism. Oh, they're witches because they're lesbians.
Yes. Yeah. It's such a fun mixing of what we would traditionally see homosexuality coded as. It's like, oh, it's a metaphor for something. And here it's like, it's intrinsically aligned in a way that I think is very smart. It almost pays homage to the way that we used to depict queerness back in like the Hays Code era and other things. Yeah, so I like it as a contemporary example, but it's also a period piece.
Yeah, and if anyone hasn't seen, although I feel like this was such a big thing when it came out, 1666 only takes up like half of that movie's runtime, because then the rest of it we go back to the 90s.
Yeah, it's actually a very well-paced film. It knows when to end that past period and come back and close up the trilogy.
Very much so. But Joe, what is your pick for gothic or period?
Okay, so I also went contemporary. As you said, I think that there's so many great examples. I could have seen us dividing this into two different categories and actually saying, like, let's pick a bunch. But for the purposes of brevity, I went with a foreign film. I went with The Handmaiden, which is a period film from South Korea. It's Park Chan-wook. It's so deliciously lesbian. The sexuality is off the scale. These two actresses have amazing chemistry together. And it's just so lush. It's visually gorgeous. And I love that this narrative, like, it knows exactly how to pace itself, how to deliver the goods, and it's extremely queer.
Very queer, very erotic, very sexy. I also think, for a lot of these films, not all of them have like the happiest of endings, but what I love about this particular film, and this maybe is a bit of a spoiler for anyone who hasn't seen it, but like this is a very cathartic and like rah rah go go.
Yes, it's a you go girl.
You go girl. Yes, that's something. It's a you go girl movie.
Yes. Yeah. And honestly, just it's again a film that I think a lot of people maybe didn't notice or maybe wrote off because they said, oh, it's a foreign film. Like, I'm not interested. It's
Yeah.
worth your time. But also, if you can endure it, I would say seek out the extended director's cut, which is even longer. It's what, 2.5 hours? But
It's about 2.5 hours. I will say though, this would make a really good double feature with Richard Shepard's The Perfection, a film that takes a lot of influence from The Handmaiden and is also very explicitly queer.
Indeed. Yes.
Our next category is vampires.
Of
And I
course.
picked, again, I hate saying it's like an obvious one, but I'm picking Tony Scott's 1983 film, The Hunger. And the reason I want to pick this is because it is often known as the lesbian vampire movie, but I feel
Although
like a
you get
lot of people.
clocked every time you call it that because it's really more bisexual.
But no, it 100% is. But that's the thing, though. Like, I feel like general consensus is from a lot of people who haven't actually seen the film, who only know it as the lesbian vampire movie. And yes, it's
Right.
100% bisexual. And it's also, though, it's so much more than that. You know, like it
Yes.
was really famous or notorious even at the time for the queer sex scene in the film between Susan Sarandon and Catherine Deneuve. But I hate that it gets reduced to that.
Yeah. It's just a fantastic movie. Like, you can't just reduce it to the sex scene, even though the sex scene is iconic and very, very important for challenging heterosexual norms.
Yes, 100%. But it's also like, it's not just there for sex scene's sake. Like, it
No.
plays an integral part into the film and in the character's development. This is a great film. I think our episode on this film is very, very, very good. So yeah, I would highly recommend, if you have not seen The Hunger and you only know it as the lesbian vampire movie that Tony Scott did, please seek it out.
Yes, please give the film its actual due. Okay, so my pick is an 80s classic. It's one of the other vampire films from this decade. I went with Fright Night by Tom Holland. So this is the OG, where the sexy man next door just happens to have a bit of a male companion who helps him move in, but also he then sets eyes on the teenage boy that can't stop looking at him. So this film is great in terms of like queer coming out. Obviously, we also have queer actors. It's just a really kind of fun, campy, vampy time. And the sweater game on Chris Sarandon, I can't fault it.
Yeah, this film played a very, very, very important part in my like my horror fandom, because it used to air on AMC all the time. So I watched this a lot in my teenage years. Truthfully, I didn't pick up on its queer tones until probably later in life. However, I think like subconsciously, I was picking up on a lot of these things, and which is part of the reason why I loved it so much.
Right. Yeah. For me, this film has so much nostalgic value. I think for other people, it's like, oh, that's my Lost Boys. Or, I think for a certain population of men, it's Freddy's Revenge. But for me, like, Fright Night is my big, like, queer coming of age film from this particular era.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I honestly I identify with Stephen Jeffries' Evil Ed a lot. And of course, Stephen Jeffries is queer in real life, but like, it's something that, I definitely picked up on when I was 14 watching this film. All right, next up is your favorite subgenre, Joe. This is the erotic thriller, and I'm happy with your pick because you did go a little bit more back in time, whereas I went with Basic Instinct. And I went with this again because we've talked about this before. At the time, this one was very controversial among the queer community for being a negative portrayal of a bisexual woman, and I understand why in 1992 that was the case, because we as a community were in a very different position politically. But I think watching it now, I don't want to say that Catherine Trammell is sympathetic, but I do love this portrayal of a really badass, strong, proud bisexual woman who is unapologetic about her sexuality.
Absolutely. And if we're being honest, this is one of those films where you think they're going to kill her for this queerness. And we don't, right? Like, every indication that we have based on the end of the film suggests that she gets away with it and flourishes.
Well, if anything, too, because again, I remember reviews at the time were criticizing this and saying like how all the men are just like stock characters. And like, yeah, but that's kind of the point. Like, all the men in this movie are idiots.
Yeah, because they're thinking with their dicks. And meanwhile, this amazing bisexual woman is out there publishing books, making mint, playing the cops for fools, and getting away with it. And also, presumably, having very hot lesbian sex.
I would say she is thinking with her pussy, but she's also thinking with her brain.
Hey. So mine is another foreign film, and it would actually make a fantastic double bill with Knife Plus Heart because they are both French, and it's
Yes.
also a period piece. So I went with Stranger by the Lake. This film is not for the faint of heart. I mean, there are debates about whether this is unsimulated sexual
Hmm.
intercourse, but basically, it involves a man who goes to a local cruising area by a deserted lake filled with other men, and he has a dangerous attraction to a man who may or may not be murdering other people on the beach. So,
This, yeah, this is one of my biggest blind spots in like contemporary queer horror cinema. I feel like I know, but it's because I know we're just gonna cover it one day. So I'm like, you know, I'm gonna
mhm,
wait until it could be like a first fresh one. Yeah,
yeah.
I've heard mostly great things about this. I know it is gonna
Mhm.
be a little slower on the
It's
slower
a little
side.
slower. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Like not as much dialogue. It's a lot about like the kind of mood and the tone. It is a bit of a like it's an out of time film as well. So it could be contemporary or it could be the 70s
Ooh,
or it
I
could be the
like those
90s.
though.
I find this like blisteringly hot. Like if I was a young queer kind of trying to figure out my sexuality and I watched this movie, it would be very helpful for me.
Okay, well, moving on, we have our next subgenre of satanic, and I went with one of your favorite films, Joe, which is of course Clive Barker's 1987 classic Hellraiser. And you know, outside of Clive Barker being the creator of this, I feel like some people
Mhm.
might take issue with us calling it a queer film because on the surface,
Right.
explicit queerness in this film, but
Mhm.
because of Clive Barker's persona and like you know how sexually charged a lot of his writing is,
Yes.
I think it's hard not to watch this film and find queerness in it.
Absolutely. I mean, in our episode, we do kind of like deep dives about some of the queerness that you may be overlooking if you're just taking it at face value. But like for me, the sheer visual aesthetic and costuming of the Cenobites alone and its relationship
Mm-hmm.
to the S&M portion of the queer community, I'm like, these are tops and bottoms, and like we're getting into leather play, we're talking pleasure and pain. Like it's there. It's there.
Well, and thankfully, at least, you know, we do get more queerness in the remake that came out in 2022. Yeah,
Two?
2022. Where we do have a trans actress playing the priest in the film, the pinhead
Yes.
role. So,
Ugh, Jamie
uh,
Clayton was robbed. She should be doing so much more with that, like
she
sequels upon sequels.
it's interesting, you know, with that movie, I feel like the impossible task wasn't remaking Hellraiser. It was making someone who almost made you forget about Doug Bradley's performance. And while she doesn't do
Exactly.
that because it's impossible, like she succeeded with an impossible task.
Yeah, she's doing something completely different that makes you appreciate, oh, we can take this story in a different direction while still being very reverent to the original.
100%. What is your pick for this? Take us back in time, Joe.
Yes, so I went with a classic for this. Any
Mm-hmm.
opportunity I have to promote a Val Lewton film, I will always take. So my pick for Satanic is The Seventh Victim. So this is a film from the 1940s. We're doing a very queer-coded lesbian narrative where a woman goes looking for her missing sister, and the sister has basically she's been targeted by a satanic cult who want her to die by suicide so that they can, inherit riches and all this other fun stuff. And
Right.
yeah, basically the queer coding is that this sister is a lesbian, and that's part of the reason why she's been targeted. There's also queerness embedded in other characters within the cult, so it's like queers targeting other queers, but it's all done in sensational black and white Val Lewton masterpiece fashion. Some great like sequences that you think wouldn't be effective all these years later, but 80 years it still hits.
Yeah, because this is also during the Hays Code time, so like
Yeah,
a lot of it has to be left up to like suggestion.
indeed. Yes.
But that's what makes those films honestly the most fun to watch because it's like okay, like they want to put these themes in their film, but they can't do
Yeah.
it in a way that's just like out front and center. So they have to find ways to sneak these things in, and so
Yes.
uh,
Very clever in that way.
yes, very very much so. But okay, so our final subgenre is one that maybe people wouldn't immediately think is like has a bunch of queer content in it, but we're going with the
Mm-hmm.
creature feature because this is also one of Joe and I's absolute favorite subgenres.
Always.
And while I could have, you know, gone with something fun that I love, like Deep Blue Sea or Anaconda or
Mm-hmm.
Zombievers,
Mm-hmm.
I actually went with Stuart Raffles' 1994 recently rediscovered film Tammy and the T-Rex. And This this is fresh in our mind because we just did an episode on this. This is a film. It's ridiculous. It's camp all over the place. It's Denise Richards dating Paul Walker. He gets killed. His brain gets put in the body of an animatronic T-Rex, which then comes alive and falls back in love with Denise Richards. And they go and kill people to find him a new body.
Do you even realize what you just said? It's so ridiculous.
It's absolutely ridiculous. But the reason I have it on this list, though, is because we do have a queer best friend in this film. Denise Richards' best friend, Byron, played by Theo Fawcett. This is a stereotypical portrayal of a queer character. You know, he's a very effeminate, queer Black man. But while there are characters in the film, specifically homophobic cops, that make jokes at this character, the character is never the butt of like the film's jokes. Like the film always feels like it is treating this character with respect, even though some of the characters in the film are not. And I really appreciate that about this film.
Absolutely. And considering the time period it's made in, that's kind of revolutionary.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, we're post AIDS crisis here, but it's still like the mid 90s, and like this is 2 years after Basic Instinct. We are not in a great place politically here. So for an indie, like super low budget schlock campy film to have a character like this, I won't use the term revolutionary, but it's like kind of getting there for me, where I'm like, I'm just surprised this even exists.
Yeah, and it's not a throwaway role either. That's the other big thing. Like, this character is essential to the success of the film.
Yes. But what is yours?
Okay, well, you kind of cued it. We're going back a couple years to the height of the AIDS crisis. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't try to squeeze in a Canadian film onto my list. So for creature feature, I went with David Cronenberg's remake of The Fly, starring Jeff Goldblum as well as Gina Davis. This is a deeply romantic creature feature, but it also is disgusting and ooey gooey. But the way that Jeff Goldblum's character sort of disintegrates when he is affected by this malady is very reminiscent of what we were dealing with regards to the AIDS crisis.
Yeah. So. And I can't even remember. I don't remember if we found quotes from Cronenberg saying that it wasn't like really on his mind when he was making this, but reviews at the time absolutely picked up on this.
Yeah, he says it wasn't a driving inspiration, but that he is open to that kind of reception and reading.
See, that's how all directors should be. All directors should be open to any kind of reading in their film.
Indeed, because as we've alluded to with several titles on this list, they can be explicitly queer, they can be queer coded, or there can just be queer readings of the content. So that's part of what we like to do with the podcast, is do multiple interpretations and readings, because they're there, they're on the table, right?
I mean, we did just do a trans reading of Jurassic Park, so I mean, like, nothing's off limits.
Nothing. It's all ours. Queer horror is all ours.
Oh, 100%. All just ours, only for us. Well, that will wrap up our special for this Pride or Die event. Again, thanks to Horror in Color for inviting us on to come and do this. You know, you can find Horror Queers on the Bloody FM, the Bloody Disgusting Podcast Network. We're all over wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Horror Queers.
Indeed, yeah. And if you have any other recommendations, or if you want to engage us, shoot us a DM, a message, or whatever.
Tweet, an email, yeah.
Basically available at Horror Queers, wherever.
I think we've been around long enough to where if you just Google Horror Queers, like, we do immediately pop up. So
yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, we can cross out this Pride or Die special.
Indeed. And cross out Horror Queers.